WHO News and Talk Radio bring you more live, exclusive interviews than any other broadcast station in Iowa.
Joining us on the live line at this time in Beirut is John Reed. He is the American Embassy spokesman. He is at the American...
We have on the line with us right now Reggie Norton, who's a spokesperson for the Washington Office of Latin America. Do you think that we should increase our aid?
Radio live report on this. Here is George A. Clark.
As you can imagine, telephone service has been disrupted to the Coalinga area, but we've been able to obtain a telephone.
Are we on the air?
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, this is another treat for me. I get to go into the Wayback Machine here and visit with an old friend.
Old? Wait a minute.
We're too old, but talk about old times. Wait a minute, not old times. Well, yeah.
Yeah, I am old.
This is historical. Yeah, I'm old too. I tell everybody asks me how I am. I say I'm young and virile. I know everybody laughs when I tell them that. That's
we
me.
Go back, George A. Clark.
Julie Gammack is
Yes.
the guest on Podcast by George today. This goes back to the golden era of radio. At least it was golden in my life. We're talking back in the 1980s. Julie, thanks for being on the podcast.
Oh, this is fun, George.
Yeah. Hello, hi, how are you?
You know, the only difference, looking at you with this headset now, is I see gray coming out instead of dark brown.
Well, yeah, and you see a little shine on it. I've got a little less hair than I used to. But
Just a little.
Yeah, that's the nature of the beast.
Didn't we have fun?
We had fun. It was an interesting time. It was the end of an era. And I try to explain that to people, and I think they have a hard time understanding that the talk radio that you did was a lot different than the talk radio of today.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to get to that, but I want to background you a little bit. Tell us about Julie Gammack and Des Moines, Iowa, and growing up. And I want to start with you as a little girl, but I also want to explain or talk a little bit about your dad, because he's, world famous, particularly for the older folks in our audience, and still remembers Gordon Gammack. So tell us about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I happened to be in town in Des Moines for my 50th.
Yeah, babe.
50th high school reunion, Roosevelt class of 1968.
Yeah.
Oh, my God, is it strange.
Yeah.
Yeah. The nice thing about Facebook is you keep sort of in touch with people.
Right.
But our graduating class was, I think, over 800.
Wow. Mine was 62.
Yeah.
What a difference.
Yeah, what a difference.
Yeah.
So it was real easy to hide back then, which I did.
Yeah.
I was not, I was pretty shy and introverted, if you can believe that. And, I'm in this sea of people that are, I kind of vaguely remember. But it was a very interesting experience.
Yeah, but then I think of you at Simpson College and kind of a political activist, would you say?
Yeah.
Because these were Vietnam years.
That's right. In fact, while a lot of the folks that were then kids back then that I was with this weekend were going to football games and pep assemblies and that sort of thing, I was already involved in politics and working in the near North Side on some things, and concerned citizens and all sorts of things like that. There was a legislative race. A woman was running for the state Senate, and my high school history teacher at the time was running her campaign, so I got involved in that. That's what my life was like from when I was 16, 17,
And at this time, your
18.
father is a world-recognized journalist, columnist.
He was one of the nicest guys on the planet.
Yeah.
He really was, and very unassuming. His legacy is probably going to be preserved as a war correspondent.
Yeah.
But there are Iowans all over this state that have clippings of his columns in their attic because he wrote about people. The war years were limited, of course, thank God. Yeah. But he was involved in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam.
How about that?
Yeah. But in the meantime, in between those, he was a daily columnist for the Tribune, which was the afternoon newspaper.
Yeah, we used to get it out on the farm. We get it the next morning.
Did you?
We get the afternoon paper. The postal carrier would bring it, and that meant you got it the next morning. So a lot of farmers actually read the Tribune instead of the Register.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Well, if you think about it, this was the time certainly before the internet, and before really broadcast television news was in its infancy. in World War II.
Right.
Well, no, it wasn't even around then, but radio was not anywhere
It was huge.
near as...
And there were correspondents from radio that went to those wars, too.
Correct.
And I got to interject here. Anytime that I see film from those wars, or we talk about like your dad being a war correspondent, those guys were right in it.
Right.
I mean, they were right there with the bullets whistling around. A lot of those guys died. And I like to bring that up because of the criticism and that journalists are getting today. And there's a lot of heroes in the journalism category that were war correspondents. Yeah, so go ahead.
Well, so back during World War II, the columns that my dad filed from there were really the only way some of these Iowa families knew of the whereabouts of their loved ones. Yeah. So his dispatches were very much valued. There's a family story. I might as well tell what the heck.
Sure.
And this was before I was born, but my mother told this story for years, that he came back from World War II, and they booked him to give some kind of talk at the KRNT Theater, which was an auditorium, and it was pretty big back in the day. And my mother was nervous that nobody would come, so she called all her friends and said, if you come to this thing, I will, you come over to the house afterwards, and I'll fix you...
Subtle bribery, yeah.
Fix you drinks or whatever. And they pulled up to the KRNT Theater, and it was packed. I mean, there were cars all over. And I don't know whether my mother said this to my father, or my father said this to my mother, but, what's going on? Is the Grand Ole Opry in town?
Yeah.
And they were all there to see Gordon Gammack.
Yeah. I'm huge in people's lives. Again, going back to these farmers that are out there, I mean, this was their contact with the world.
Right.
And they had a personal relationship, kind of,
right,
with somebody like your father. So when he's appearing in a personal, like they're going to be there. That doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
So I got to ask you, we talked about the anti-war activism. Your father saw the wars up close and personal, saw the horror of it. Did that shape you as far as your perception? Did you come by that on your own, or did you get that from him?
It's interesting. If you think about it, here, so much of my father's life was dedicated to covering Iowans at war, and of course he had a very up close and personal look at war. And by the time 16-year-old Julie Gammack comes around, I didn't know what he'd done or what I've heard about it, but it wasn't, when you're 16, you just don't really fully grasp.
Well, tell me about it.
Yeah. You just
a lot of things I didn't fully grasp.
Your folks are they did this, and I'm boring. But,
I just wanted to grasp a girlfriend. I think that's the only thing.
Exactly. Careful, you got to watch out what you say. Don't try and get on the Supreme Court.
Yeah. We'll get to that.
Yeah. No, let's not. No. So I became very concerned about the war, and of course, the Vietnam War was a very different kind of thing than the wars my father had covered, and so back in World War II, there were all kinds of Iowans that fought together, but by the time Vietnam came around, there wasn't that cohesive sort of
you mean like Iowa regiments, like
correct,
yeah,
like the 34th Division
right,
in World War II, which was predominantly Iowans. So things were very different, and he'd gone over to Vietnam, and I think he was shocked by what he saw. It wasn't, it was very different from the Victory Garden days of everybody all in it together during World War II and pulling for the cause. And I think, although I truly never had conversations with him about this, so this is pure speculation, but I think he was very troubled by what he saw. I don't recall him being angry with me for being anti-war. I think he was an observer of what was going on in the country, and happened to be his daughter personified a generation, and he personified the other generation. So,
yeah.
But I always felt he respected me, even though I had 16, 17 years old, 18 years old. So it was not something. I bet anybody listening to this wishes they could have a conversation with their parents if they're gone, that they wish they'd had.
Yeah, don't wait.
Oh,
yeah, I tell people that all the time.
Don't wait, and get a little recorder and record it.
Yeah.
Because, there's no do-overs. I can't tell you how many times I wish I could call up my dad or ask him, or my mom, and ask him, well, what was that about? What were you thinking?
It's hard for I do have some younger listeners on this podcast for them to understand. Do you think about your dad every day? Mm-hmm. Something comes up. Mm-hmm. It's that free. Even still, he's been gone for me for I think it's 6-7 years, something like that. But
right.
It's always a part of your life. Well, so that the political part of it I get. How about the journalism side of it, the newspaper, radio experiences that you've had? Was that an influence from your father? Did you take that up because of his background, or was that all on you? How did that happen?
Oh, George, this is so embarrassing.
Yeah, well,
I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up.
Well, I didn't either.
I still don't.
I'm with you. I'm just going to say I don't know if I do yet.
I still don't. So, I was an activist, and I didn't have a clue how I was going to make a living. I did get involved in political races and volunteer, and then paid positions, and I didn't have a picture of where I was going. I marvel at people who, decide when they're X years old that they're going to go to law school and they're going to be a lawyer, or they're going to go to med school and they're going to be a doctor, and that's what they're going to be all their lives.
I had a friend like that. We were at Drake together, and we happened to have some freshman entry type class together. This guy was in the law school, and I'll talk about him sometime on the podcast also. But the first day of class, I'm sitting next to him, and the class ends, and I'm like, I'm late for the door. Let's go to a bar. Let's do something like you do, Mm-hmm. This guy gets up, walks down, talks to the professor, and he says, "Hi," introduces himself, shakes the guy's hand. Professor was kind of taken back from it. He says, this friend of mine had a deep voice anyway. He says, "What do I need to do to get an A in your class?" And this guy looked at him, and he kind of laid it out. And I'd never seen anybody do anything, but he was that kind of guy, like you're talking about. He had a chart, he had a path. He was in law school. He was going to be an attorney, and that's what he became. And he was a good one. And I've always marveled at that.
Wow.
But I'm like you. I showed up. My first day of classes, it was about a week into the calendar. I took what was available, and they asked me what I wanted to major in. And I said, well, I'm not any good at math, not any good at science, and I can write a little bit, and I'm pretty good at talking. Well, you sound like a broadcast news major. We're going to put you in the J school.
Oh, somebody gave you some guidance.
Yeah,
Good.
right. Well, I think it was a woman filling out forms at the front desk. I don't know this. She was not a career counselor, I don't think, but it turned out that way. Yeah. So yeah, that's how it happened for me.
Isn't it funny how just a casual conversation can change your life?
Oh
like
yeah,
that?
I'll never forget it. Yeah.
Yeah. So no, I had no idea how life was going to unfold, and I think my folks just wanted me to go to college to meet and marry. That was the era.
That's their generation.
What women did.
Yeah,
we didn't have careers back then.
That's what guys like. That's what I was hoping for. It didn't happen.
Oh well.
Yeah.
Anyway, so how I got into broadcasting was there was a woman who preceded me at WHO by the name of Susan Bray.
Oh, my God, Susan Bray. Now, this is where we meet. This is where George comes into the picture, a little piece of your life. But Susan Bray, was she any good? And she's still going, right? I mean,
she's in Australia.
Is she on the air?
No.
No, okay.
No, but she was outrageous, the saucy Aussie. Right. And if you think back to those days, there were very few women in broadcasting. Right. As a matter of fact, Mary Jane Odell, who had been Mary Jane Chin way back, had a television show on Channel 8 as a young woman, but that was unusual. And when she went to ask for a raise, the general manager said, "Well, why should I pay you when I'm paying so and so? You have a husband." I mean, that was the era. So there are very few women in broadcasting. And that's a little issue I have today with Des Moines
I'm
Radio.
with you. No, I understand that. Well, I have an issue with the broadcasting pay scale overall for everybody. But go ahead. Yeah, let alone that. Yeah.
So Susan and I would have lunch every Wednesday, I think. Monday. I guess it was every Monday. Susan Bray and I would have lunch. I'm not sure how that ever came about. I don't even remember how I met Susan and her producer Beverly Davis.
Yep.
Do you remember?
Sure.
She'd be somebody fun.
Oh, Bev's got some stories. Yeah.
Bev has some stories. Anyway, the three of us would have lunch every week, and it was a hoot. And Susan had an offer to go to work in Philadelphia.
I remember that.
And she looked at me in all seriousness and said, well, why don't you audition for my job? Now, I have had two phobias in my life: public speaking and writing.
Really?
Yep. So, yeah, I
Public speaking, I get that, but writing?
Writing. Yep. So, yeah, in fact, I told my biology teacher in high school I really would rather flunk the course than give an oral report. And that didn't fly with my folks. So, I'll never forget that. I was just miserable.
I was a member of Toastmasters for a while, and I remember him saying that people that have that fear of public speaking, it is second only to near-death experience.
Yeah.
It's real.
It's real.
It's palpable. I mean,
I still feel it, and I do it all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so, but for me to have somebody like Susan Bray, who I had just the utmost respect for, look at me and see somebody who could step in and do her job, I was blown away. I was completely blown away.
Yeah. By this time in your life, though, you had a pretty good experience set and you had a lot of political knowledge in particular. And, of course, that's a lot of what that show is.
Right.
That's what talk radio is today.
Right.
So I can see that part of it. Maybe not the public speaking experience, but the knowledge set, you're probably ahead of the game at this point.
Well, I didn't think so,
No.
but I needed a job.
That's a motivating factor, folks.
So I said, well, okay, I'll audition for this job, and I did with a hangover.
Really?
And talk about self-sabotage every step of the way. I did everything possible.
Well, these were back in the drinking
subconsciously.
days,
Well,
back when people used to, including yours truly,
Yes.
used to drink a lot.
Oh, we won't
Yeah.
name names, but
No.
remember so-and-so would come into the studio just absolutely plastered?
Right.
Yeah.
It was not that unusual.
Last
Well, and
initial
from the night
was
before,
Z.
some people know, yeah. And we talked about Z a little bit on an earlier show.
Oh,
But
and then there's Dwayne Ellen. Well, anyway.
yeah.
So Susan thought I could do this. And for me, that experience of having somebody believe in me was something I wanted to give back for years. I realized the power we have as individual human beings to change the course of somebody's life. And if, as long as it's authentic and you aren't bullshitting, and you really do think somebody can do something,
Right.
if you give them that feedback, it can change their lives. So I've made it somewhat of a mission to do that in my life and every other domain since then.
Yeah.
So I got the job. I don't know how. Remember Bob Gifford, the program
Sure.
director?
Yeah.
Never said a word. Never said a word. He took me into the studio.
Do you have a toupee?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Took me into the studio. Oh, and he wore rubber-soled shoes.
The squeak.
So you could never hear him coming,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Am I right? So he brought me into the studio. This was the old building, and showed me where the 7-second delay button was, and said, "Good luck," and turned around and walked out.
Yeah.
And I
Take
was
it.
live.
Yeah. Wow.
And they gave me the job. I still don't understand that.
Well, it
But-
worked out. It was a great era. It was a great show.
Well, thank you.
It was a different way of doing things. One thing that was extraordinary about it compared to today's talk radio environment, it was fairly liberal.
Yes.
And there's none of that. Air America, does it even exist anymore? I mean, there's not very many liberal talk show hosts.
No.
It's all gone to the right. And I've talked about that a little bit because that era came in right after ours. And it came in in the persona of Rush Limbaugh primarily, who I blame for a lot of what's wrong with this country to this day. It starts with that guy. But before we get to we have the good, the bad, and the ugly. Before we get to the bad and the ugly, let's talk about the good. What are the highlights for you from the WHO years? What?
Oh, it was so fun. You know, once I got over my terror, which took about 6 months, as soon as I realized I could call for a commercial, you know, anytime something got uncomfortable, I thought, oh, okay,
safety
I can
net.
do this. I'd just go to Menzel and say, let's take a break.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
There we go. So after I got comfortable doing it, it was just a blast. You know, I found that it was the skills you learn in that kind of environment are skills you take else. You know, how do you get somebody to call in? This was the day before cell phones. This was the day when pretty much the only people who could call a talk radio show weren't at work. They were home.
Right.
And so, but you also had to balance the people that you put on the air, knowing that your audience was much broader than that. So you couldn't just have a little old lady from Lamoni dominate the
not
whole,
an accurate reflection of the overall.
Dominate the whole time. So you learn to think in the big picture and not just react to the moment that you're in. I don't know if that makes sense, but we had a lot of fun. Yeah.
But you did some good stuff.
Well, it's kind of a blur now. Thank you.
Well, and the other thing people may not recall or even know from that time, there's something called the Fairness Doctrine that was in play that balanced a lot of this stuff out, and I was aware of it because I was in the news business, and it was particularly apparent at WHO or here in the state of Iowa because we had two senators, like Grassley eventually and Harkin. So the Fairness Doctrine meant you had to make an attempt anyway to get the other side of the issue. That would be true on a talk show as well as in the news. But we had to, and if it was a national issue that Grassley had an opinion on, let's pick up the phone, call Harkin, because they were going to disagree on a lot of those things. Because one guy's mostly a liberal, the other guy's mostly a conservative. But there was an effort to truly present fair and balanced news coverage, radio
really
coverage.
Felt that was important.
Yeah.
I mean, I really did. Obviously I had a point of view, but I guess I just felt kind of old school about it, that I really wanted to present all sides.
It makes for a better show. It makes for a better conversation. It gives you different ideas, different leads, from the other side.
But George, hate brings out passion. And that spikes the numbers. And I think that's what started happening is, you had to, or people felt anyway, that to get the numbers, to get the accumulated numbers, you had to be outrageous in a angry way.
Right.
And that's what's
well,
happening.
Hello, Rush Limbaugh. My perspective, or my opinion about that is we had the Fairness Doctrine and the Reagan era. Reagan got rid of that. And so they didn't have to present both sides of an issue, and the stations were under the control of corporations primarily, or wealthy individuals, and that means they were on the right side of the political spectrum, and it gave birth to right-wing Republican talk show hosts like Rush Limbaugh, and they didn't have to balance it. So this guy got syndicated. And the Newt Gingrich Congress got rid of the monopoly prohibition on ownership of radio stations. So just a few corporations now that have that political perspective own lots of stations, and they can syndicate Rush and guys that followed him, and they're dominating the airwaves today. I was listening to Michael Medved today. Oh, my God. Have you ever heard that? Holy mackerel. That's something else. And they were talking about the Kavanaugh hearings, and they state these things as absolute fact. Again, no attempt to balance it or whatever, but what they were saying was Bill Cosby got sentenced today. And they said that the chowderheads on the other side, the left-wingers, are already citing Bill Cosby's sentencing as a reason to hang Kavanaugh. And I'm like, What?
Yeah.
How do you get there? What are you talking about? I haven't heard anybody say anything like that. That didn't have anything to do with Kavanaugh. The two allegations are not the same, but their followers now believe that a little bit of what's going to come up in this Kavanaugh hearing now is a direct result of people wanting to do something because of Cosby's conviction. Because this guy says this. He's got a huge audience. And that's what's out there.
I do think, George, that the podcast era, or this podcast phenomenon, I guess, that's really starting to take on, and I'm so glad you're doing this, is going to grow and grow and grow. I would not want to have an AM license in this day and age.
Yeah, no.
A radio
They're dying.
license,
Yeah.
or even FM. I think with satellite radio and podcasts, it's just changing. Now, the downside of it is that we can pick and choose the people that we agree with and not listen to other points of view.
Right.
I figure at this stage of life, I really don't have to listen to somebody,
Right.
Well,
are your podcast? Is your media going to be a window, or is it going to be a mirror? That's the difference.
That's a good
Yeah.
point.
So use these podcasts as a window. I mean, let in the light, learn,
Right.
enjoy,
Right.
get new experiences.
There's an Iowa podcaster, Pat Reinard.
Yeah.
He has Iowa Starting Line. I've not met Pat, but I've listened to his podcast, and it's wonderful because he did an interview with Rob Sand, who's running for auditor. Now, as print has become less and less important or responsible in terms of doing features on these candidates running for down ballot races, it's a real missing piece, because unless you can somehow find a way to meet these people and go to town halls and that sort of thing, you don't know who this guy is. Well, I was able to listen to this interview for, I think, 45 minutes.
Yeah, where else would you get that?
Where else would you get that? I thought, wow, this guy is really cool. Wow, this is a rising star. And yet, I don't know, I'm speaking out of turn here because I'm not in town often enough to read the daily newspaper, but I don't think there's been a profile on these down ballot races. And there are really some rising stars. But because podcasts, wherever I am in Chicago, which is where I live full time, or on the Chesapeake Bay, which is where I like to be otherwise, I can listen to a podcast with Rob Sand and find out about, my hometown.
That's
my
great.
home state.
And listen to podcasts by George.
Yes, I will now. I just subscribed.
You got to do that.
I like the name, By George.
Yeah, well, by George, I think he's got it. I hope he does. We'll see.
So tell me how you got into this. What made you?
Well, to be real truthful with you, I've had a lot of people through the years say you ought to go back on the radio. I don't have any interest in going back on the radio. I told them, I said, that's like dating your ex-wife. I mean, that's not going to end well. I don't want to do that. I don't have any great love for the radio business or industry. It's changed, but I never liked it the way that it was, to tell you the truth. So I'm not going back to radio, but I kind of felt badly about it because I haven't been a raging success at a lot of things in my life, but one of the things I was pretty good at was radio. So if you're good at something, you feel badly about just giving it up completely. So the podcasting opportunity presented itself. I went and revisited one of the old stations that I used to work at a long time ago and talked to some people there, and I listened to people, and I saw, listening around, God, I can do that. And so podcasting was it for me. I've got the time to do it. It is time consuming, but I love the opportunity to go out and interview and revisit people like yourself and bring something new and different to people, hopefully, that they're not getting elsewhere. And this is it for me.
Well, I love it. I'm envious of your having picked up the equipment and actually done. I was with Mary Brubaker the other day. And
was she any good?
Here's
I really liked her.
a woman
Yeah.
who was, just talk about an institution.
Yeah.
Mary Brubaker had her daily television
What a wonderful
show.
person. Great
and just
personality.
Great person. Knows everything. And, she's 80-some years old.
Is there? Ugh.
I don't know if anybody's ever sat down and interviewed her.
Yeah.
But there's somebody.
She'd be great.
She'd be a great interview.
And she was one of the pioneers of women on television.
Yes.
and broke the mold, and finally had a very prominent position on local television. You know, like you say, it used to be the women were relegated to cooking shows or fashion stuff, or boy. You know what it reminds me of? Have you seen the Dallas television station that was on the air live when Kennedy was shot? That's kind of a hobby of mine, the Kennedy assassination. But they were in the midst of it was noon in Dallas, and that's when they put a lot of these shows on. And there's a woman demonstrating the zipper on some top or something like that, and Kennedy's shot, and she's like almost physically moved off of the set. They're not about to let her utter a word about the president being shot to death on the streets of Dallas, and the news anchor comes on and he's smoking a cigarette because he was smoking a cigarette at the time and he forgot to put it out, I think. But she was shuffled off to Buffalo, and it was her show, but she wasn't about to get to say a word about that.
You know, in terms of podcasts, have you download David Axelrod's podcast?
Yeah, I've seen it.
He does the best interviews, you know, and of course he has access to anybody he wants.
Yeah,
but,
they'll do his show.
You know, the format of actually having a conversation with somebody uninterrupted, and he does his homework. He'll by the time he walks into an interview, he has all kinds of stuff about the person that he's interviewing, and
unlike me.
I'd be in the wing it category too. But
well, I know my subject matter, so
there we go.
Right.
There we go. But podcasts are great. I'm so glad you're doing it. Kevin Cooney started one called with some other people called Wonks. I don't know what's happened to that. I haven't seen any recent updates, but that was fun.
They build slowly. If you don't have a huge following to begin with, if you're not a famous name like David Axelrod or somebody like that, you're going to begin with you and maybe your spouse listening to yourselves. I mean, and you got to be cool with that, because it's going to take a while to develop listeners. And if you've been doing it for a few months and there's only a couple of dozen people listening to this, people quit.
Yeah.
You know, it's not as much fun if nobody's hearing it. So
right. Well, I'm thinking maybe, because I try and search for the things I'm interested in. So Iowa, of course, is one of the things I'm interested in. Maybe if you put that in a tag or something.
Yeah, you can do that. Yep.
Because I didn't know you were doing it until you reached out.
Yeah, well, I haven't been doing it very long. So,
okay.
I mean, we're in the slow build phase right now.
Yeah.
So this is going to be like my baker's dozen podcast.
So do you see getting sponsors someday, or
that's how most podcasters make most of their money. You can, once you get enough followers, once you become a Joe Rogan or somebody like that, you can get a lot of advertising and make a lot of money. And the other way to do it is to write a book, sell that, sell T-shirts, coffee cups, all that kind of stuff. But I'm not really in it for that. That's behind me. I don't need a vocation. I don't.
Right.
Everybody can use money, but I don't even need that really.
Right.
I'm doing it just for the opportunity to share and to just go talk to people like you again.
Yeah.
So that's what it is for me.
Well, I think it's fascinating. You may inspire me to do it one of these days. We had my husband is Richard Gilbert, and he had been the press secretary to Bob Ray, Governor Ray.
Yeah.
And so when Governor Ray died, and the funeral was here in Des Moines, and we had a bunch of the staffers here in this condo after the service, and I thought, God, each and every one of these people, I'd love to sit down just like this and do a podcast.
I got to ask you about Bob Ray. There was a lot of criticism of Republicans after Bob Ray's passing because they all wanted to honor his memory. They all seemed to be Bob Ray fans at that point in time. But the criticism came when people, maybe me even included, would look at him and say, you wouldn't vote for Bob Ray today, Mr. Republican. At least half of your party wouldn't vote for him. How do they reconcile that?
You got to ask them, George.
Yeah.
You got to ask them.
You haven't heard, do they have a defense? Is there an argument to that, or do you know what it would be?
All I can say is that most of the people I know personally who were Bob Ray fans, supporters, staffers, the ones that I know, now that doesn't mean everybody, and there are exceptions to this now that I'm saying this, but most of them are no longer Republicans. The Republican Party left them, with notable exceptions. But at the Ray funeral, Ken Quinn spoke, David Oman spoke, and somebody else who's affiliated with Drake and who runs the Ray Institute there, and I apologize, I don't remember his name. But they all talked about Ray's welcoming of refugees.
Right.
And, I was...
Which no one would support today.
Well,
nobody on that side, nobody in that party would support today.
I was sitting in the middle, kind of towards the front, and the Republican office holders currently were all in a row in the first pew, and then the Democratic officers were all in a row in the second pew. And I just was watching the faces of these people. They were just looking stone ahead. Because, Joni Ernst is there, Terry Branstad is there,
and Chuck Grassley's there.
Grassley is there.
I said that on Facebook at the time. And it goes to that point that I made earlier, that if Bob Ray were running in a Republican primary for governor of the state of Iowa today, Joni Ernst and Chuck Grassley would not support Bob Ray.
You're probably right. But anyway, it's sad to see what's happening.
It's where we are.
It's where we are. And
are we going to get out of this? You're one of the more astute political observers that I know. What do you really? I mean, you've had your finger on the pulse of Democratic politics anyway for decades. Are we going to get out of this?
I think one of the most exciting things that has happened in a long time is the numbers of women who are running for office for the first time. It's like Susan Bray looking at me and saying, "Why don't you run, or why don't you be a talk show host?" Thought it never crossed my mind, but now this true wave of whatever, anger, fury, has caused a lot of people to run. Now they know they're not all going to win. They're fully aware of that, but a lot of them are going to win, and so it's a motivator. It's a motivator. We'll see what happens in the midterm election, but I'm excited about the candidates that I know of who are running here in Iowa. I think there's a nice young crop of candidates, and of course Fred Hubbell. We are so lucky in this state that a guy like Fred Hubbell, who is willing to serve he doesn't need a job, and he just has a lifelong passion and commitment for this state, and looked around at the mismanagement. And
that's going to be a huge news story. Everybody looks at presidential politics as far as direction is concerned, but who wins that election for governor of the state of Iowa? Which way do you want to go? Iowa. This is going to be the litmus test. Mm-hmm. We're going to find out, because we're going the other way and have been for some time. Are we going to reverse course? That governor's election will tell you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be watched nationally. That's a huge deal.
And I think there are some congressional races. I would be surprised, but I wouldn't be shocked if Steve King gets knocked out this time. This J.D. Schulten is, he is working. He is working it. He is going to all these counties and towns, and I think there's some kind of something in the air.
Well, here's what I hope.
Going to happen.
I hope Steve King's a little bit like a lot of the former Trump supporters. I think a lot of people, if you question them, if they talk about Steve King and they're a supporter of his, the same way with Trump, they support him, but then, I know. Maybe not this time. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's too much, just too much with those guys. They won't admit it, but when they get a chance to go in there and pull the lever, I think maybe they won't. Mm-hmm. They're not going to pull that one.
We'll see.
We'll see. All right. So, are you still involved? Are you working for any campaigns? What do you do?
I make contributions, little contributions here and there, and
you do what you can do.
I do postcards to voters. Have you heard about that? It's great. I don't know who started it, but postcards to voters. You can log in and you get a list of voters, and whoever it is, they target races around the country, and you sit there and personally write a postcard, and they're all, you doodle and do that, so it's not a typical piece of direct mail. When somebody receives this postcard, they realize somebody actually sat down, wrote it, drew the pictures. Vote for this guy and why and da-da-da-da-da. So I do some of that.
Right. And you don't have to do, you can take your time. You don't have to do thousands of them because there's thousands of people doing them, right?
Exactly. If I do 25 in, a couple weeks, that
sounds like fun, yeah.
But there are all kinds of little efforts like that going around, and I must say I haven't. Oh, I did do some door knocking in the primary here with Charlotte Hubble, and hope to do some other stuff before the election. I have to divide my time between here and Chicago, which is where I still work part time.
Are you officially retired? You're working part time, you say, or how?
Yeah, no, I'm not officially retired. This is gonna sound, you're gonna wonder, like, what? How did you end up doing this? But I coach a CEO group in Chicago. I have Vistage International is an organization that has people like me working with groups of anywhere from 12 to 18 CEOs who meet once a month. And in addition to facilitating the monthly meeting, I do one-on-one coaching with the members. We don't talk politics.
Well, I was going to say that's interesting because there's a lot of positivism for CEOs in the Republican Party. A lot of the way left Democrats in particular, CEOs are not top of their list. As you know, they're...
they're reflective of America. Some are I'd say half my group are Democrats, but again, that's not the purpose of why we come together.
No, but politics, it's a huge shaping factor. It's always there. Do you purposely work around it, or you just don't have to? You just don't go there?
Well, their issues are strategic. They're operational. They're not obviously. Policies in Washington and the state impact business, but there's not a lot we can do about it in our collective group. Now, some people are involved in industry lobbying efforts and that sort of thing.
Chamber of Commerce lobby is hugely powerful.
But that's not the purpose of our group. I will tell you that one of my guys has a meat processing company in Chicago, and Tom Harkin does these disability summits in Washington, where he gathers employers together to learn how hiring the disabled can be beneficial. And so I did get one of my members to send his HR director to that last year, and they had phenomenal response. They actually, their HR person took it on as her personal mission and got consultants in to talk about, to help them devise programs and that sort of thing where they could make accommodations to hire people with disabilities. And last time I talked to him, and this is just in the last year, they've hired 8 people, some deaf, some I'm not sure what all the disabilities are, but so that's a way I can, kind of impact based on my own policies, values, whatever.
And the public speaking part of it, you're good with that?
Yeah, at this stage of life, who cares?
Yeah,
right.
That's great. Well, that's great. And these podcasts, they vary in length. I've had some that are 8 minutes long. I've got some that are, I don't know, close to an hour long. This one will be a long one. But the good part about it is we can do another one.
Well,
we can come back and do this again.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever.
And maybe there's a Julie Gammack podcast in the offing.
Julie Gammack.
Maybe I need a co-host.
By Julie.
Yeah.
You want a co-host?
Podcast by George and Julie.
George and Julie.
That sounds the George and Julie show.
George.
Yeah. Okay. I got seniority. Yeah.
That was a joke.
Oh, that's great.
Oh,
that's
gosh.
a possibility.
Oh well, you got all the equipment, and I think it'd be a hoot. I'd do it.
Yeah.
I'd do it. I'd love to have an excuse to go, get some of these stories recorded. Mary Brubaker, for God's sake. She knows everything about everybody in this town.
Yeah.
And I don't know if anybody's interviewed her. Do you?
No, not for a heck of a long time. I don't know if anybody, and I'm going to do it.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
I remember going to a party at the governor's mansion with her. She was kind of like our tour guide for a group of us that went up there, because she knew everybody and was welcome. And that, I don't even think they do that anymore. But as a reporter, that was really fun to go up there and have somebody that knew the ropes show you around. So,
I talked to somebody at the Register about this idea years ago, and it never went anywhere. But I think there'd be some interest in a Former Islands podcast.
Former
Islands, because they're all over the place.
Oh, they're everywhere. In the news business, we always used to say that if there's a plane wreck someplace, there's an island on board.
There's
so,
an Iowa connection.
You bet the... Yeah, and there used to be plane wrecks seem like every other week, but we don't have very many of those anymore. No plane crashes, not plane wrecks, I guess.
All right, George, this is fun.
Yeah, we're going to wrap this one up. We'll come back to this at a later date, I hope. But I want to thank everybody. Thank Julie for being on the show, and thank you for listening to another podcast by George.
Now, may I add something?
Shoot.
Okay, if you're listening to this, tell your friends to subscribe to Podcast by George.
Yeah, my wife is on me all the time to do this. If you want to go to the website, it's easy. It's www.podcastbygeorge.com. Just go into iTunes, query podcast, YouTube, Facebook, Spotify, Google Music. There's a line in the old Blues Brothers movies that I cite all the time. I'm like a rash all over the computer. When the Illinois Nazis look up Elwood and Jake on their computer, they find that they're a rash all over the computer. Well, that's me. So yeah.
What's your email address? Give it to people if they have suggestions for people that they'd like to have.
The easiest way to do it is just to go to the website podcastbygeorge.com and hit the contact button and request show topics. Provide stories that you would like to have covered. Suggest guests that you'd like to have on the show. Tell me what you like and don't like so that it can be tailored, because the listenership in this build phase is small. So if you're listening, there's a good chance we're going to do what you want. So, so just ask. All right.
George,
so
thanks.
That's it. All the best from Podcast by George.